Welcome to today's Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a really fascinating and honestly quite complex perspective on child labor laws in Pakistan. We're basing this on some incredibly insightful analysis by Umair Raza Buddha. So here's the thing. We're looking at this central paradox where sometimes the absolute strongest protective measures we put in place might actually be creating massive, completely unintended vulnerabilities. It's a deep socioeconomic issue. It touches literally millions of lives, and we're going to break down exactly how well-meaning regulations can sometimes totally miss the mark. Because, think about it, when does protecting youth actually put them in more danger? Sounds totally counterintuitive, right? I mean, we naturally assume that strict rules keeping young people out of the workforce are just universally good. It definitely feels like the right thing to do. But what we're going to explore today is how well-intentioned policies, when they're applied without really looking at the harsh, day-to-day realities on the ground, can inadvertently cause a lot of harm. It's kind of like building a giant wall to keep danger out, only to realize you've just trapped people inside with a totally different kind of threat. So let's jump right into Section 1, the minimum age dilemma. Good intentions, blind spots. To really get this, we have to look at the stark contrast between what the law actually says and how businesses operate. By law, specifically looking at the Constitution of Pakistan and the Factories Act, kids under 14 are strictly prohibited from working in hazardous environments. And the International Labor Organization generally sets that minimum working age at 15. But here's the kicker. The law doesn't completely outlaw all forms of work for teenagers between 14 and 18. Yet, a lot of companies in the formal sector have adopted this super rigid blanket policy. They'll literally only hire people 18 and older. Mostly, they do this to ensure education is completed and, frankly, to avoid any legal gray areas or PR nightmares. But this brilliantly highlights the core issue. Umair Raza Buddha captures it perfectly in this quote. While this may appear ethical, it fails to account for ground realities. And honestly, he hits the nail on the head. It's so easy to take the ethical high ground from a comfy, air-conditioned HR office, right? You just stamp 18 plus only on a hiring policy and you feel this sense of moral accomplishment. But that black and white approach totally ignores the nuanced and often desperate truths of the region. A boardroom policy that looks great on paper doesn't actually put food on the table for a family that's just struggling to survive. Which brings us to Section 2, the harsh ground reality. Because to truly understand why a strict 18-plus corporate policy fails, we have to look at the daily lives of these young people. In Pakistan, millions of kids are completely outside the formal school system. For them, education is a luxury, not a fundamental right. For families living below the poverty line, having a child bring in income isn't a choice. Actually, scratch that. It's not just a choice. It is an absolute necessity for survival. In huge cities like Karachi and Lahore, you'll see kids as young as 6 or 7 forced to work in really dismal conditions. And because they're locked out of formal, safe corporate jobs by those 18-plus policies, they end up at unsafe auto repair shops, carrying heavy loads in markets, or working in hazardous brick kilns. This isn't an after-school job to buy extra clothes. This is raw survival. Take a second and just absorb this number, 50 million. According to the Pakistan Bureau of Statistics, there are 50 million people in Pakistan between the ages of 10 and 19. We're not talking about some small fringe group here. This is literally the core of the country's future. To put that 50 million into perspective, that 10 to 19 demographic makes up 22% of Pakistan's entire population. That is literally a quarter of the country. So when corporate policies just lock out everyone under 18 from the formal organized workforce, they aren't just, protecting a handful of kids. They are leaving a massive, highly vulnerable demographic out in the cold to fend for themselves without any safety net whatsoever. So what's the result? What happens when a rigid ban collides with a family's desperate need to survive? Well, because these 14 to 18-year-olds absolutely have to work, barring them from safe factories doesn't magically stop them from working. It just pushes them into the shadows, straight into the unregulated informal sector. By shutting the door of a brightly lit, monitored factory on a 15-year-old, companies inadvertently push that teenager into hazardous, off-the-books environments. And out there are no safety protocols, no limits on working hours, and zero oversight. It makes these young workers infinitely more vulnerable to physical abuse and severe exploitation. But we're not just going to highlight the problem today. Let's move to Section 3, a balanced engagement proposal. Because what if we flipped the script?
What if, instead of an absolute ban, organizations opened up pathways for youth aged 14 to 18 to work part-time under the strict condition that they are also enrolled in school? This reimagines the whole system. It doesn't force a teenager into this brutal choice between daily survival and long-term schooling. It actually makes both possible, and it does it safely within the formal economy.
The author actually lays out this really brilliant corporate responsibility blueprint. It's 4 steps. Step 1, employ these youths on a strict part-time basis so they have a reliable legal income. Step 2, collaborate directly with schools or NGOs to guarantee they're getting a formal education while they earn. Step 3 is providing actual mentorship and skill development in safe conditions. And finally, step 4, and this is absolutely crucial, HR must strictly monitor their work hours. This rigorous oversight is the glue holding the whole shebang together. It ensures the kids aren't overworked, protects them from exploitation, and leaves them with enough energy to actually study. Without that monitoring, the whole thing falls apart. Implementing all this, though, takes a big cultural shift, which brings us to Section 4, breaking the stereotype. There's this deeply ingrained idea that teenagers simply can't be productive workers in a formal setting. But the reality is, with the right structure, they are incredibly capable. If we channel their energy into a half-work, half-education model, the benefits are absolutely huge. First, they actually gain the education they'd otherwise have to abandon. Second, they earn that vital income for their families. Third, they build immense self-confidence and become really engaged members of society. And fourth, and most importantly, this dual approach actively breaks that stubborn, generational poverty trap holding their families back. It's a real game changer. But it requires a fundamental paradigm shift. Companies have to stop defaulting to these restrictive policies where young workers are viewed purely as a legal hazard or a liability. Instead, we need to treat them as incredible raw potential. Potential that can be cultivated with care, structured education, and real corporate responsibility. It's no longer about turning a blind eye to the problem, it's about making a calculated, active investment in the future of the country. So how do we actually pull this off? Let's wrap up with Section 5. The way forward. Fixing something this complex requires a synchronized dual-pronged strategy. Prong 1 is policy reform at the government level, creating laws that explicitly allow and support conditional, safeguarded employment for 14 to 18-year-olds specifically tied to education. But, laws are just ink on paper without action. So Prong 2 is active corporate participation. Companies have to step up to bridge that gap between education and employment. One simply cannot work with the other. The government provides the legal framework and the corporate sector provides the physical opportunities. Together, they can make early work a stepping stone rather than a barrier. Butta concludes his analysis with this incredibly powerful thought, and I think it perfectly summarizes the whole argument. Let's work towards a Pakistan where no child is forced to choose between earning a livelihood and getting an education, because they deserve both. This whole explainer isn't about endorsing child labor. Not at all. It's fundamentally about finding deeply ethical, pragmatic ways to manage a complex reality that we just can't ignore. So, I want to leave you with one final question to chew on. How can we adapt our well-intentioned policies to reflect actual ground realities and truly protect the next generation? Because when rigid rules meet desperate human struggles, it's usually the most vulnerable who fall through the cracks. It might just be time to rethink what true protection really looks like. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and I really hope this sparks some necessary conversations on how we balance law, ethics, and human reality. See you next time.